them on the chat and we will pick them up. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Alan, a man who needs no introduction. Alan was editor of The Guardian for 15 years, from 1995 to 2015. Actually, that's somewhat more than 15 years, 20 years. And under his leadership, the paper was responsible for many groundbreaking stories, the Snowden allegations, the phone hacking scandal, coverage of the war on terror, but also had to grapple with a totally transformed media landscape with the rise of the internet and the tech giants and the threats to the traditional sources of revenue for the media. And that's all chronicled in Alan's book, Breaking News, which tells that from the perspective of the editor's chair. Alan is currently chair of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, as well as being principal of Lady Margaret Hall. And I'm really delighted that you can be with us this evening. Thank you very much. In your book, you say that in one sense, Donald Trump has done journalism a favor. And this to quote, in his cavalier disregard for truth, he has reminded people why societies need to be able to distinguish fact from fiction. At their best, journalists do that job well. COVID-19 has been a life and death issue for readers, and it also reminds us of the real importance of serious journalism and being able to distinguish fact from fake news and providing readers with accurate and reliable information. Do you think the British public has been well served by the media coverage of the COVID crisis and given them the information that they need?
Well, I think broadly, just as a reader, I think the newspapers and broadcast media have done a pretty good job with COVID. And the interesting thing, I'm sure we'll get on to talk about this, is how much and to what degree people agree. I mean, how much do people trust what they read, and that sort of brings in where you kicked off with Donald Trump. I mean, I think people were aware maybe a year or two ago this profound sense of sort of standing on the edge of a precipice, that this realization that society can't work if you don't know what's true and what's not true. You can't have law, you can't have science, you can't have government. Nothing works unless there's some agreement of what the factual basis for what's being said is. And with the president of the United States really trying to muddy the waters deliberately, so he targets probably the best newspaper on the planet, the New York Times, and repeatedly says this is fake. And I don't believe, I mean, that's not accidental. What he's trying to do is to say, if even the best newspaper is fake, then anything is believable. You might as well believe me. And then we come to this, as you say, a life and death matter where what you read could determine how many people die. And I think this was a sobering moment for journalists, thinking, actually, this really matters. It really, journalism, which sometimes feels like a game, is not a game. And I think, you know, we can talk about the exceptions to this rule, but I think by and large, journalism has risen to the challenge of trying to understand the science, trying to explain it carefully and responsibly, but also not allowing government off the hook and holding the people who are in power pretty powerfully to account. Yeah, and in terms of holding the government to account, do you feel that the press has really exposed to serious scrutiny the government's conduct at the crucial stages, at the early stage when other countries seem to be proceeding at a much faster pace into lockdown than us? There certainly seemed to be a high degree of focus and attention on the part of the media to the fact that we didn't seem to be doing what was happening in the rest of the world, and international comparisons coming to the fore. Do you think that
had a potentially quite a serious influence on government policy at that crucial early stage.
I think maybe some journalists were quite slow to appreciate the gravity of what was going on. I mean, I remember those sort of slightly smirking articles about Italy and what was going on there, and a failure to appreciate that was likely to happen here, even though some scientists were saying that. So I think, it's sometimes a difficult balancing act as a journalist. I mean, this wasn't a war, but it was a time when the nation had to kind of pull together and unite. And it's a difficult balancing act to know how critical to be when. And I think there evidently were plenty of grounds to be critical earlier. But I think, this was a young government at the time. People maybe were willing to give it the benefit of the doubt in a way that they have been less willing recently. So I think if the criticism is that there seems to be a high degree of agreement now that we got into lockdown too late, we should have done it sooner. I think they're probably, when that story gets to be told properly, I don't think you'll find many journalists were at that point calling for more urgent action.
And the science, I mean, one of the challenges of reporting something like this is that scientific accuracy really matters, and explaining potentially quite complex science to the lay, the general public. Do you think that in terms of sort of conveying that, because it seems that the media has been where the public has gone for information, particularly television, also newspapers, that seems to be where the public has sought information. Do you think that the media have explained well, how the nuts and bolts of how this pandemic has been working and the risks that it represents?
Well, I think the best journalists, certainly, and there are some wonderful science and health journalists who do a very complex job well. So it isn't easy. I've seen journalists do it. I mean, when I was editing The Guardian, we had 4, 5, or 6 people, maybe a bit more, writing about health and the environment and science. And quite a lot of them had PhDs and could take a very complicated scientific paper and make it explicable and readable. I mean, I think there is a sense in which some newspapers who have over the years cut back on the really knowledgeable specialists have struggled a bit during this crisis, because actually what the general public want, I think, is people who can explain and contextualize and use some judgment, because those of us who are non-scientists are learning the degree to which there is no such thing as the science. There are scientists who have perfectly reasonable disagreements. And having somebody who is well-versed enough in science to be able to negotiate that is really important.
The Reuters Institute has done a bit of a study on public consumption of media coverage and response in terms of who they trust among the different media organizations, and some have fared very much better than others. The results perhaps aren't greatly surprising, but maybe you'd like to say something about that.
Well, I think maybe the most obvious finding is how trusted the BBC is. So if we can cast our mind back only 3.5 months, there was this initiative that sort of came out of the blue, except that Dominic Cummings had, I think, been thinking about it for maybe 15 years, of changing the funding basis of the BBC, which is really an attempt to dismantle the BBC. And Cummings, in his infamous blog that he wrote around about 2005, said, we want more outlets like talk radio and like Fox News. Well, you'd have to be mad to think that we want anything like Fox News in this country. I mean, Fox News had an almost lethal disregard for the facts of this crisis, and at least in the earlier stages, it was just parroting the White House line. So I hope, you know, the very high levels of trust for the BBC in the sort of late 60% should put the debates about the BBC, or some of the debates about the BBC, out of frame. I was pleased to see that The Guardian has emerged as I think the most trusted newspaper. But there are caveats in all this. I noticed from the Reuters research that there was a terrible plummeting in trust in politicians over the last month, and that's doubtless to do partly with the Dominic Cummings reporting, but also a big plunge in trust for the media. And I feel, you know, having worked in the media for a long time, 40 years, journalists really didn't know how to interpret these questions of trust. And I think there may be a very profound thing about if you're outside the media, you tend to lump politicians and the media and bracket them together. So if you start losing faith in politicians, I think the media take a collateral hit in that. And it's interesting to think why that is.
One of the questions that's popped up on the chat is, how do we make the political price for politicians who tell lies higher? How can we better hold them to account when the public is seriously misled? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I sort of think that's really not, I mean, it's certainly the media's job to try and expose untruths and lies by politicians. And I suppose, like a lot of people here today, I've watched seeing how, in a way, politicians being caught out lying or telling the truth seems to matter less. That puzzles me. I mean, it astonishes me to look at Trump and sometimes Johnson and the people around him and think, but don't people care about the truth in public life? But I think it's not for journalists to comment about what the price for lying should be. I think that's a sort of, you know, a democratic discussion that we all have to influence in some way.
Do you have a sense that the reporting of COVID-19 has exposed sort of gaps in the public interest journalism we would all like to have? I mean, are there areas where real weaknesses have emerged that say something broader about the challenges facing the media landscape at the moment? I'm thinking particularly about local news, but there may be others.
Well, I think the reporting of politics is quite troubling at the moment. The Johnson government, do you remember one of the first things they did was to try and limit the number of people who could come to the lobby, and there was a sense that they weren't going to have old-fashioned lobby briefings. And then I think a very bad habit started in which shadowy number 10 figures, we can imagine who they are, realized that if you started unattributably leaking stuff to journalists, they would rush it out on Twitter in a completely deniable and unattributed way, so that you had no idea where this was coming from. And sometimes this material would turn out to be not true within 2 hours. And there was a sense that some very bad habits from Trump have been imported over here. We've seen how brilliant Trump is at distraction. So if he's in trouble, he will throw the media fishes and say, no, look over there. And the same sense that's happened to political reporting here. So I think that really matters. And these bizarre events that happen each day, which are not quite press conferences, and you feel, you know, that they're being used as platforms to make statements, but often with no news. and journalists are not really given the chance to have 2 or 3 follow-up questions in the way that you would need to. This as a barrister to really pin something down. All this feels to me no substitute for public accountability in a really rigorous way. So I think there are big question marks about political reporting.
Mm. And part of that is also the unwillingness to put forward ministers for detailed interviews where follow-up questions are possible. That's the other side.
Yeah, well, again,
isn't it?
At the beginning of the Johnson government, that sort of massive sulk where they refused to put any ministers up on the Today program, and various other times they've boycotted Newsnight. And there is a Trumpian sort of sense, just as Trump takes on the New York Times, of this government taking on the BBC and trying to denigrate it and delegitimize it and saying, well, we're not going to be held to account. And that just seems to me breathtakingly arrogant and actually at a time of national crisis just wrong. I think if you're a minister in this government, you have a right to, you have a duty to come along and explain yourself and be questioned.
Yeah. One of the themes of breaking news is the existential threat to journalism posed by the internet, the rise of the tech giants, the loss of traditional sources of revenue, and your role as editor in steering the Guardian towards a new business model for sustaining serious journalism. Do you think the COVID-19 is going to hasten the decline of serious journalism, or perhaps galvanize us into finding new and creative ways to fund public interest journalism?
Well, it looks as though the economic model that worked for 200 years is rapidly disintegrating. That's being felt most acutely in the local papers. Local papers were kept afloat by house ads, by property ads, by job ads, by car ads. All that's going. And a lot of local papers responded, perhaps inevitably, by cutting back on journalists. So the papers became thinner and less interesting. Then people stopped buying them, and you got into a death circle, a spiral of really, which is difficult to get out of. I think there are some countersigns of journalism that is of really good journalism, quality journalism that is bucking the trend and piling on the subscribers during this crisis. New York Times done particularly well out of Donald Trump, as I said in the book. For every time Donald Trump says "Don't read the New York Times," the phones burn with people taking out subscriptions. And I think there will be new models. I think there will be. We're at a time when the old economic models, which was essentially a private revenue streams, are being replaced by people considering whether news is a kind of public good or maybe an act of philanthropy. And there are some interesting models emerging in which people are not paying so that I can read it, but you can't read it, but that so everybody can read it. That's essentially the Guardian membership model, because where we came in, because societies don't work if you have very well informed elites and everyone else watching Fox News or talk radio. That's a recipe for a terrible society. And so I think people are realizing that actually regarding the supply of unpolluted information is almost like a public service, like an ambulance service or a police service. It's just something society needs, even if there's not a conventional business model for it.
You gave an example when we spoke earlier of the the Texas Tribune, which I hadn't crossed my radar previously, but I'm sure other people would be interested in it. Can you say something about that?
A very interesting man called Evan Smith, who came through Oxford this year, and He's very serious. He has sort of slick back hair and wears double-breasted suits and looks like a sort of guy from a 1950s B movie about journalism. And he watched the decline of serious journalism holding the institutions of Texas to account. And he's really created a philanthropic model of saying we will report anything that spends public money. So he just does the state house, the police, the health services, the water companies, the utilities. He started with 7 reporters. I think when I saw him, he had more than 70 reporters. And that's all he does. He doesn't want to do celebrity. He doesn't want to open up in Baltimore or Philadelphia. He just wants to do Texas. And there's a huge appetite for that kind of really serious, engaged reporting about the things that matter to people's lives, their schools, their hospitals, the public health, the policing. Goodness knows these are important things. And if the conventional model, which used to sort of mix celebrity reporting and then slip a bit of that in as well, is failing, then maybe there will be an appetite to go back and fund people who will do that Texas Tribune style of journalism.
Very interesting. I'm going to ask some of the questions that are now popping up on my screen, or that people want to raise directly. One question by Mark Kember asks where the balance should lie between independence, balance, and a clear editorial line. Is it possible, really, for a media organization to be independent?
Well, it's a very complicated question because there are so many different forms of ownership and styles of journalism. In some ways, the UK is the opposite of the US. In the UK, we have the BBC, which does its best to be independent and impartial, or fair, whatever word you want to use, whereas the press tends to be rather politically attached. In America, of course, it's the other way around. The New York Times is more like the BBC, whereas the Fox News outlets are more like Fleet Street. And I think rather late to the game, I've decided that it's probably undesirable to have editors who are in charge of both news and comment. I just think it makes it really difficult to separate the two in your mind, however good you are as an editor. I think probably newspapers would gain in the sense of people believing they're independent. If you believe that if you had, as they do in America, an executive editor who's in charge of the news and somebody else who's in charge of the comment, and it's 2 completely different jobs. And I think there are too many examples in the British press of news coverage that is led by the opinion of the paper or the editorial board or the owner or the editor in a way that undermines faith in the credibility of the news. I don't think anything's going to change as a result of me changing my mind, but that's where I've ended up.
You give in the book, you give the example of the Brexit coverage as one very potent recent example of where you felt the British public were not well served by the press, by the traditional press.
I mean, I think whichever side of Brexit you were on, if you're going to have a referendum, you're going to ask the people to decide, then you better educate the people. And your job as a journalist is to say, well, look, here are the arguments on both sides. We will explain it as well as we can so that you're going to decide. If you want to know your opinion, our opinion, we'll tell you at the end. And that's almost the opposite of what most newspapers did. Most newspapers said, look, we know what has to happen. We're only going to give you really one side of this question. And we're going to use our front pages repeatedly and increasingly shoutingly to will the end that we want to happen. And that just seemed to me a terribly damaging view of what journalism should be doing. And I think it's been tremendously damaging to trust in journalism.
Thank you. I'm going to ask people to come forward with their own questions. So if you would like to, if you want to ask a question now, would you be good enough to unmute your video, and then I can call upon you, and if you unmute your sound as well, you can ask the question you want to ask. So I'm just going to try and keep my eye out for anyone who's popping up in front of me. As nobody, as I, hello, Joe, please fire ahead with your question.
Hi, Alan. I'm interested in this concept of holding the government to account, because it seems to me that throughout the COVID pandemic, as you rightly said, there was no such thing as the science. There were lots of different opinions. And I suspect that most journalists don't have quite the same access to the range of scientific opinion as the government does. So it's interesting to me on what you mean by holding the government to account in a in a kind of environment of high uncertainty and much disagreement. And there has been a tendency to, if you like, give airtime to scientists, to individual scientists, without a health warning that this is an individual's opinion, it's not the science. So I'm interested as to how that holding to account has actually worked.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess, I mean, I think, I mean, I'm obviously not editing anything at the moment. I'm just consuming media like everybody else. And I'm not sure that you're being quite fair to the way my former colleagues are working. I mean, as a general reader who knows nothing about this field, really, you know, I became aware very early on that a lot of the running was being made by the people at Imperial. And then I read lots of health warnings saying, but the people at Imperial have got a track record which is, let's say, checkered, and that there's a completely different view coming out of Oxford, for instance. And so I think from very early on, as a reader, I was on my guard to think, well, you know, here are these very clever people at Imperial, here are these clever people at Oxford. They don't agree. I think it was unfortunate that it took a long time for the SAGE minutes to be published, and for even the membership of who was in the SAGE committee. But then this more recently, this sort of alternative SAGE has popped up under David King. And again, there you've got more scientists who you can weigh against the official scientists. And you've got people like Jeremy Farrar, the director of Wellcome, who is on SAGE, but also a considerable epidemiologist in his own right. So the impression I'm getting is of quite a sort of lively debate. That's just the British scientists. And, you know, we know there are Swedish scientists with different views and Americans. So I don't know. My reading is of quite a sort of full account of this argument between scientists. And I guess, you know, it's too early to see who's going to be proved right. And the holding to account bit, I think, comes from airing all those views and questioning the ones, you know, if we were just reporting the chief scientific officer, then I think that would be a reasonable criticism. But that's not my experience of reading the news at the moment.
Thank you. Stefano, I understand you have a question. If you'd like to unmute your video and your mic, please.
1 second. Sure. Yes, Alan, thank you. I'm an ex-Reuters scholar and now in comms for a think tank. And just for looking at this, more than any other time in my life, fact and truth versus fiction is utterly important. The most important thing that we have today, as far as I can see, versus spin. What puzzles me is why haven't the big agencies like Reuters, AFP, Bloomberg, AP, and all the quality newspapers, you mentioned quite a lot of them, the FT, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Economist, and the broadcasters, BBC, etc., got together and in a big global campaign or whatever it might be, to say how important factual based reporting is. In other words, fight back. You know, I don't understand it. I mean, I'm puzzled by it after being in the media for 20 years and in comms for 5.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm out of it too. I don't know what the answer is. If I had to hazard a guess, I think there's something about those assertions by the media on behalf of the media that I think sometimes people shrug. You know, is it the New York Times or the Washington Post at the moment? It's got this brilliant phrase: "The democracy dies in darkness," which is a great phrase. I'm not sure if you had the BBC and the Guardian and the FT doing a sort of marketing campaign on behalf of news, that it's going to work. I think the only way you can do it is I mean, there have been various attempts. There was something called the Newspaper Marketing Association or something, which used to take full page ads out in newspapers and say, look, aren't we great? Here are some wonderful things we've done recently. And somehow I don't think it cuts through. I think this crisis of trust at the moment is so profound that the only way that you can earn it is on a daily basis by just getting it right and doing it in the right tone of voice, and doing it in a way that the readers will respect and believe. I don't think journalists getting together to say we're great is going to work. I think we're beyond that, sadly.
I see both Charlie and Kevin you've got your videos on. Kevin, do you want to ask a question? You had your video on first.
Yes. Interested in some more of your thoughts on the BBC, Alan. You know, prima facie, it seems like that is, given where we are in the UK, one of the best and, you know, quite unique shots we've got at maintaining a high quality political discourse. And I'm wondering what you think should be done to shore that up, and what the opposition should be saying or doing to provide more support to that, given how important it is.
Thank you.
Well, in the end, people are either going to buy this argument or not, that reliable, truthful news is a kind of public necessity. I think people do realize that, and I think maybe I could agree with Stefano to the extent that maybe newspapers, instead of saying we're great, buy us, should spend more time explaining the economics of news and how news is financed. And actually, the BBC model kind of works. It employs a huge number of journalists, locally, internationally, and nationally. It is hugely respected and trusted, and it's can be consumed by everybody. Now that's all three of those things are very powerful recommendations for the particular business model of the BBC, which is effectively a form of taxation. Now, if that form of taxation, which is currently attached to the ownership of a TV set, is not going to work in future, which it's probably not, then we probably have to look at two different things. One is a different kind of taxation. And there are several countries that have got there ahead of us, particularly Scandinavian countries. I think the Norwegians are the most recent country to sort of find a different form of taxation. And the second thing, which is that something could be settled once and for all, is to remove the BBC from any kind of political, not just control, but any kind of political influence. So it is terrible for the BBC when any government can hold over it the threat that when the next license fee negotiation comes up, they're going to suddenly charge the pensioners, or we'll do this or we'll do that. They're currently making not so veiled threats that they're going to get rid of this DG who's not even in place yet and replace the current chairman with a different chairman. I mean, this is lamentable, awful behavior. And so we've got to just take the BBC out of any kind of political influence at all. And so I think a government that was bold enough to say, yes, we should pay for it through taxation, and we're going to create an arm's length arrangement so that no government of any colour can ever again have that kind of influence over the BBC. I think these would be hugely popular measures. Not universally popular, but hugely popular.
Okay.
Thank you. Charlie?
Yes, this is more of a reflection that I'd love to sort of hear some feedback on, but it seems to me that we have to tackle and have a almost national or international debate about the role of social media in our lives. And it's something that's come up so fast in the last 10, 15 years that we don't seem to have got to grips with it. And until we do, a lot of the issues we're talking around trust and fact versus fiction, etc., is just not going to be solved. And I'd be interested to hear sort of response on that.
Well, I guess the reason that we haven't got to grips with it is it's such a complicated question. So these entities have sprung up in the last 15 years. And they're entities that the world has never seen before. No, there has never been an occasion where the opportunity for 4 billion people to talk to each other. I mean, I'm stating the obvious. So how on earth do you control that, regulate it, keep it clean without destroying the wonderful things that social media represents as well? Do you want one platform across the world, which was a kind of sort of utopian dream of 15, 20 years ago, which could operate to the highest standards of free speech? Or are these platforms going to be effectively splintered into 160 different platforms? I mean, these are huge questions, but they're not going to be solved by next Tuesday. I sense an awful lot of people saying, well, we've got to regulate them and do that immediately. But if we regulate them, then Saudi Arabia is going to regulate them, and Putin's going to regulate them, and China's going to regulate them, and then Pakistan is, and then Erdogan is, and that's the kind of end of one kind of dream of the opening up of discourse around the world. So it's a very delicate thing to get right. And so, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I think it is a really vital thing to do. I just don't think it's an easy thing to do.
Do you think there's a role at all for sort of seeking to educate consumers to become, in a sense, more critical of the news content that they receive from social media? And perhaps it's a question of, as a challenge that we face as a society that comes into the educate, it becomes part of education for young, just as young people are asked to learn to look at history critically, so that they learn to look at sources of information critically and analytically.
Completely. I mean, I know media studies was always, people rolled their eyes at it. It was a kind of joke subject, but I would teach it in every school from about the age of 6. I mean, seriously. I mean, I think we have to train young people to read everything, old and new media, critically, and to be able to think about sources and where things come from and why people are saying things and how you check, and to use the tools that we have to determine if something is true or not, or likely to be true or not. Not to, I mean, but basic things about our own responsibility. Never retweet something unless you're satisfied that it's true yourself. I mean, otherwise, you're just creating, adding to the problem. So I really would. I mean, I've seen it even at Oxford. I remember a class I was teaching 2 or 3 years ago. I asked everyone to bring along something they had read in the last week so that we could sort of have a discussion about it. And quite a few of these young kids, they would produce something, and I'd say, well, where did that come from? And they'd say, Facebook. And you say, okay, where did it come from before Facebook? And they'd look at me blankly. And I said, well, you realize that Facebook hasn't got any reporters. Facebook is not creating news. Facebook is aggregating news or amplifying news, but it's not. And these were bright students. So I think the problem is a really dire one.
Very interesting. On a slightly different tack, one of the questions that keeps coming up is in relation to the position of the local media and the vulnerabilities, the specific vulnerability of the local media, and conversely, the importance of people being able to get access to really good local news. Is there anything else that you feel you can say about the position of the local media as in particular?
I think it's, I mean, it comes back to this. I mean, I'm sorry to keep coming back to these really basic questions, but I think this is the stage we're at. So we have to imagine what societies will look like when there's nobody to watch them. So, the local newspapers they're dying already, and some have already died. And there are already communities that are uncovered. So imagine what those societies are going to look like in which there is nobody outside applying scrutiny about how the budgets are spent, or who is winking at who when they allow such and such a planning application going through, or whether the local police force has a problem of racism, or whether the local hospitals are clean. I mean, all these sort of really basic things that we would want to know about our communities. And which local newspapers at their best used to do rather well. Now, as we've agreed, the model for that is going or gone. So that, I think, needs to lead to a discussion saying, well, let's agree on what kind of news we need about our communities. What do we miss now that we haven't got it? And then think about how that's to be funded. Now, for instance, about 150 million quid recently went into, I think they called it the local democracy reporting, which was saying, well, we do need somebody in the council chamber, and we do need somebody in the courts. Justice, it's all very well justice being done, but justice has to be seen to be done. So where do we want these representatives on our behalf to be, to do what kind of reporting? Who's it going to be available for? And it may be that we have to sort of put those exercises out to tender. If we want a reporter in every court, then maybe people could tender for that job. Maybe somebody could jump up and start courtreporting.com who would do that. But it has to begin, I think, rather than just chucking more money at some people who doubtless got quite lazy and forgot what the fundamental role of a news organization in a local community was. Be a bit more like the Texas Tribune and say, well, we're just going to do the following five things because we think it's important, and to get public buy-in to that.
Yeah, thank you. One of the on a different tack, the Facebook and fact-checking on Facebook, the model seems to be at the moment that they are funding quote unquote independent fact-checking to, seek to verify information online. Do you think that that is a good model? Have you any thoughts on alternative models?
Well, I should declare an interest because I've just been appointed to the Facebook Oversight Board, which is a different, slightly different thing. It's an attempt to try and review the policies and decisions of Facebook to try and get a sort of consistent to help those fact checkers and moderators. So I think Facebook is putting in lots of these kinds of levels. We could spend another hour saying all the things that are wrong with Facebook, and I might well agree with a lot of that. But I think what you've got is a company that is full of very bright engineers and clearly very bright commercial people who are saying, well, actually, we shouldn't be taking all these decisions. Now, it's a difficult one. There are people who say, well, you're the company. Yes, you bloody well should be taking these decisions, and you should be doing it better than you are at the moment. Or you can say, well, who is Mark Zuckerberg to be making these incredibly crucial decisions that affect all our lives? And when Mark Zuckerberg says, look, it shouldn't be me, it should be someone else. So I'm going to sort of independently give money to these arm's length fact checkers because they're the professionals. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? This is why the debate is so raw and new and so important that I think we should. My personal view is we should welcome these initiatives. Some of them will turn out not to work. Some of them will turn out to be cul-de-sacs, but some of them may turn out to be really valuable pointers to the future.
Thank you. A follow-up question on the local media. Is there a role for national media in supporting local news outlets to improve the quality of their local reporting?
Well, most national news outlets have got no money. So I think it's difficult to go to the Daily Mirror or the Daily Telegraph and say you should be supporting the South Wales Morning, the South Wales Echo or whatever, or the Birmingham Post. I think that attempt to create a local democracy fund was an interesting one. Whether that should have gone to existing players, or as I said, whether that should have been sort of bid for is a different question. The BBC is all over Britain in one form or another. I mean, it's one of the most dispersed. I mean, it's too central, but it's still very dispersed and has got a very powerful local media radio network. There is the Press Association, which is out there and reporting from all parts of the United Kingdom. In some countries, I believe it's the case in New Zealand, that it's a kind of sort of reverse thing where everybody puts their content into their local press association, so it can then be shared. So I think we're going to have to think radically about different kinds of models. There was a very interesting debate in the FT at the end of last year, essentially about it was corporations beyond profit. What is the purpose of a corporation beyond profit? and looking at these different kinds of models of social enterprises and mission-centered corporations. And I think that's another interesting debate. You know, there are some news organizations in the States now that are essentially registering as charities, as 501c3s, and so this idea of we're never going to make a profit out of this, but we have got a mission and a purpose, which is a good one, and which society needs. And what incentives can you give us to do that kind of work? I mean, a bit like a health service or a lighthouse. I always think, you know, the society needs lighthouses, but there is no business model for a lighthouse. But you're going to have a lot of wrecked ships if you don't have lighthouses, even in an age of GPS. And so society at some point decided we must work out ways of funding lighthouses. And, you know, I think that's the stage we're at in thinking about good, truthful, fact-based media.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you very, very much for an incredibly thought-provoking and stimulating discussion. This isn't a very good forum for getting the claps of everyone, but on behalf of everybody else, I'd like to thank you for a really fascinating question and answer session. And I'd just like to hand back to Ben now to have the last word. Thank you.
You should have had fake applause like at the Premiership when they
You can see claps of yellow hands appearing across the board. Firstly, can I say thank you to Alan. I found that really, really interesting, and to Guy for conducting the interview brilliantly. That was much appreciated. Just to remind everyone that this is the first in our series of issues trying to look at constitutional issues, how we govern ourselves post-COVID, and trying to look at issues which are hopefully relevant under the government's agenda. Whilst I imagine among some of the people on this call, at least, the idea of electoral reform might be very exciting, I'm not certain it's about to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. So what we were trying to look at was issues which are alive. And our next one is with Simon Jenkins. We move from former editor of The Guardian to former editor of The Times, who will be talking about localism. So please register for that. It's on the 1st of July. You'll also see other Radix events on our website, and please do join us for those. You'll also see 1 or 2 events with Politica, which is our youth organisation, our youth wing. And whilst I suspect there aren't too many people on this call who are between the ages of 16 and 24, I suspect there are quite a few of us who may have children in that area range. And if you would like to try and engage them in politics, our next Politica event is an In Conversation with Tim Farron, talking about his leadership. It's about the 4th of those events we've had. Tom Tugendhat before that, and Alicia Kearns most recently. Lastly, just to say that like the media, Radix is a not-for-profit these days, and we are a charitable organisation. If you've enjoyed this evening, if you're enjoying this series and our events, please do think about it, whether you could make a contribution. You'll find a donate button at the top right-hand corner of our webpage. That will take you through to our Just Giving page, and we'd really appreciate any support that you wanted to give us. Finally, just a thank you once again to Alan and Guy, and a virtual yellow clap for you. Thank you again. Good night. Alan, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Guy. That was expertly chaired.
That was a very nice interview, and I thought we got through an enormous amount of stuff in a very short time. I think Guy may have booked himself presenting for us again.
Great, fantastic. Okay, nice.
Have a good one.
Yes.
Take care.